Well, we'll start the conversation by welcoming my first guest. He is a chartered accountant and the former chairman of the Office of the Procurement Regulator. I'm joined by Mr. Moonilal Lalchan via Zoom. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Ketan, and thank you very much for having me this morning on the show, and a special welcome to all your viewers wherever they are.
Well, thank you very much for joining me, Mr. Lalchan. And the conversation surrounding the OPR, well, there was a proclamation of the Procurement Regulations Act last week, but there's a bit of a twist. Your term as chairman came to an end on January 11th. Now, let's start the conversation there, because you said you've had no regrets about the work that you've done in the last 5 years. Precisely under your tenure, under your leadership, what has the OPR achieved over the last 5 years, given that public bodies and private entities were calling for its full proclamation? What would you say you've achieved in the last 5 years?
Well, remember we were appointed in 2018 January, and that's the first board. That's after we had partial proclamation in July of 2015. The act was actually passed in 2015. And the partial proclamation allowed for the appointment and the setting up of the office. Since then, we have had, when I left, it would have been over 325 different sessions with public bodies, different stakeholder groups like the Contractors Association, Chambers of Commerce, Rotary Clubs, sporting organizations. So it was all in preparation to make sure that they were aware of what are the implications of full proclamation. In addition to that, the whole issue of how you do procurement would have been part of the whole designing of regulations to support the act. So all those regulations were prepared and passed to the Honorable Minister of Finance to lay in Parliament. Those regulations were actually approved in the upper and lower house in January and February of 2022. We would have prepared over 44 handbooks and guidelines to guide public bodies in terms of what is required to do their own procurement. And I'll come back to that later on if we have time as to how we would use those handbooks and guidelines. For example, if you look at the regional corporations, you had about 14 regional corporations, and every regional corporation would have had different ways of doing their procurement activities. So now you have a standard type of approach where the handbooks and guidelines will guide the regional corporation, regional health authority, public bodies like ministries, and so on. So 44 of those were completed and approved at the office level. We would have set up, and this is particularly important, now under regulations, the public bodies, by definition, should not be using any contractor or supplier that is not registered in the OPR's database. And we would have had many sessions with public bodies and also suppliers and contractors to make sure that they understand that they cannot be doing business with persons who are not registered. And we would have had over about, I would say, about 1,500 persons come onto the database to be registered and approved as suppliers and contractors. Now there is a very intense period that we'll be going through, because all suppliers and contractors now are rushing to get registered on the database. So that, in addition to that, we would have had sessions on how you go about preparing your annual procurement plan. The annual procurement plan by the public bodies is also very important, because now, 6 weeks after the reading and passage of the budget on an annual basis, all public bodies must publish on their website all their upcoming for the next 12 calendar months activities as it relates to tenders and contracts that they intend to go into for the next 12 months.
Now, Mr. Lalchan, if I may just interject for a moment there, you've always been a positive individual, always optimistic. But Could we say with absolute confidence that the last 5 years has bared fruit? I mean, what was the strength of the OPR without the full proclamation of the legislation?
Could you repeat that? It coming across a little bit muzzled.
I'm saying that you've always been optimistic, you've always been positive, but could you say with absolute confidence that the last 5 years has bared fruit? The strength of the OPR also relied on the strength of the legislation, which was not fully proclaimed.
Well, the sections that were proclaimed actually gave the office enough information and leeway to develop all that I've spoken about. And the strength of the OPR now consists of a board that is still in place, and also the strength of the employees that were brought on board, because from July of 2018, you would have had employees coming on board and being trained in all the different aspects, and they were part and parcel of all that I've spoken about so far. So we do have a very strong OPR. Now, whether or not all the public bodies would have taken the necessary steps to be compliant and get ready is a question that we would have answered on several occasions, because not all, based on the readiness assessment checklist that we would have developed, would have been taken advantage of becoming ready. So now there is an intense rush to get ready, and I can guarantee you, as we speak right now, not all public bodies are in fact ready and in a strong position.
Mm-hmm. And with respect to the office of the Procurement Regulator, there's a bit of a twist, as mentioned at the start of the interview, because even though the legislation is there, the legislation is in place, it is without a chairman. Now, the deputy chairman is there, although the position is part-time, one might say. So then, without a regulator, without a chairman leading the office, the authority, then really what direction is the OPR heading in? I understand that they're making efforts to try and fill that role, but your tenure ended on January 11th. That's about 5 months ago.
That's correct. And to get to understand what is taking place, the deputy chairman is one of, I would say, 9 board members now. Now, the board has to be consisted of no less than 8 and no more than 11 members. So we are down to 9 because one of the board members would have resigned and that position would have not been filled. Mm-hmm. Now, you have 11 board members, and this is taking it in context, and you'll understand why I must explain this part of it. So the deputy chairman assumes the role of the regulator. In the absence of the regulator, what we have right now is a vacant position of regulator. He is actually, I would say, on a part-time basis, because he has his day-to-day activities as a private operator to deal with. And therefore, upon full proclamation, you could well imagine that the regulator or the chairman now is really a full-time job, and it's not an 8 to 4 job. It's more than 8 to 4. So that goes past beyond 4 o'clock in the afternoon, especially now. So it will take a lot from the board, the deputy chairman, and also the members of staff. But more importantly, so the position of regulator was not filled for 3 months. Mm-hmm. Come next year, January, you have about 4 board members whose second term would have come to an end. And if those positions, if 2 of those positions are not filled when they become due, the board becomes non-functional, because now you go down to 7. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have a regulator, the existing vacant position of a board member is not filled. And the reason I'm saying that is because there are specific requirements for the qualification and experience of all those board members when you look at the Act under the Section 10. Mm-hmm. Additionally, The regulator is entrusted with the day-to-day operations. So it's not only about the act and regulations and handbooks and guidelines, but the management of the staff and the day-to-day HR issues is the responsibility of the regulator. So those things have to be put in place. When you come to things like challenge proceedings, investigations, and so on, the regulator will be have to be on top of that on a day-to-day basis. So it's not just about sitting in a chair and saying, well, the office continues to operate. It is very important that you do have, whether it's Moonilal Lalchan or another regulator suitably qualified, you have to have that person as a matter of urgency sitting in that seat of the regulator.
Well,
Otherwise, if it's prolonged, you can lead to issues of persons asking for relief and not getting it.
Mr. Lalchan, is it a matter of coincidence, or is it just rather peculiar that 5 years you're there as chairman, as your term comes to an end, about 4.5 months later, the act is, well, more or less fully proclaimed? I mean, isn't that rather coincidental, or is that just something that's peculiar to me?
I think it's probably interesting to also note that just about when the term of office was coming to an end, we had a change in president. And as you are aware, the appointment of the regulator is an independent appointment by the office of the president in consultation with the prime minister and the leader of the opposition. The old president would have been, everybody was aware sometime in January, I think it's around January 20th, that happened, that the information was out in the public domain. And the new president was only inaugurated, I believe, on the 20th of March, somewhere around there. So it's not only the office of the regulator that has to be appointed, but there are a number of different things that the president has to take into consideration. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I am very pleased that we do have full proclamation, because we would have worked at the office very, very hard at the board level and the team. So we were expecting it. Mm-hmm. And yes, 5 years would have elapsed, or how much time we would have spent in getting prepared. And therefore, it is very, very commendable that we do have a full proclamation. That cannot be turned back now. And therefore, all the bits and pieces, we would have had meetings, I can tell you, with the old Attorney General, the new one, the Minister of Finance, the Junior Minister of Finance, a number of other ministers. We would have met with their teams, all the different agencies that I would have mentioned, Contractors Association, Law Association, and different players. No, all that took time. So yes, 5 years. And immediately after the regulator would have demitted office, it was proclaimed. That's fine. We are very happy with it. So I don't think it was coincident, but some people may want to speculate and think that it's coincident. But I think in due course, we will have a regulator in place.
And if called upon to serve once more, are you prepared to be at the helm for another 5 years?
Ketan, I would be on record to show that I have served to the best of my ability in all different governments. It's not only the present, and in private capacity, I would have served my country. And one of the things that I always speak to when I have these sessions at the OPR, yes, we speak about value for money, integrity, accountability, and the one I think we would have left out is legacy. What legacy are we leaving for our children and grandchildren? And if there's anything that I want to make sure that is I serve my country to the best of my ability. So I stand ready to serve in that capacity or any other capacity. And it is because when we look around today in the country as to what's taking place, over and over, we need good men to stand up and good women to stand up, because evil continues to persist when good men do nothing. And I will consider myself to be a good person, ready and willing to serve in any capacity that I'm called upon to.
Well, Mr. Lalchan, I'm grateful for knowing that, because I understand as well that you've already been asked to submit your CV. as part of the application process. Just before we close, there was something that we were going to get back to as it relates to a handbook that was created and developed for organizations. If you'd like to just expand on that, something that was actually achieved under your leadership of the OPR.
Let me say, Ketan, with your last statement, I have not been approached to submit my resume to be considered.
Okay,
so I'm not
thank
sure.
you for correcting that, because
I'm not sure if you have inside information.
No, I don't have any inside information, actually. I may have just misread a newspaper article if I glanced at it. So,
Yes, that is correct. So now, with full proclamation, public bodies have to operate in accordance with the Act and the regulations and handbooks and guidelines. These handbooks and guidelines, for the number of years that companies and organizations and ministries have been operating, they had their own internal processes, procedures. So now what we have done in the handbooks and guidelines, we have published these handbooks and guidelines. So there are two things that the public body needs to be aware of. Either you operate under the published handbooks and guidelines that is approved by the office, or if you choose not to operate with those handbooks and guidelines, you have to prepare your own handbooks and guidelines that is to be approved at the office level. So just assume, which is another reason why you need someone in the seat full-time. Let's assume that 314 public bodies decide that they're not going to accept the handbooks and guidelines as published by the office. And 314 come in at the same time to bring in their handbooks and guidelines to be approved by the office. You could imagine the kind of chaos that will emanate from that.
yes.
But I can tell you offhand that there are several ministries and state-owned enterprises and so on have already indicated their willingness to accept the handbooks and guidelines that have been approved at the office level. So we would not necessarily have that problem. But you do have some with unique circumstances that will want to develop their own handbooks and guidelines, and that will be welcome. Or they can use the same handbook and guideline as published by the office and put some appendices to reflect their unique circumstances, have those approved, and off we go. They can then practice under the new system.
Well, Mr. Lalchan, I want to thank you very much, and I appreciate the correction, actually. You see, this is why it's never really too good to glance in the middle of an interview. It's because when in 2018, you were actually recommended by the TTCIC, and that is when your CV was submitted based off of that recommendation. But thank you very much this morning for your time and for sharing this information with us so there is a better understanding of how the OPR operates. I think we've had for some time now conversations about the actual legislation, but exactly how the OPR operates is certainly something that we all should be aware of. So thank you for your time this morning, sir, and I wish you all the very best.
Most welcome. Always a privilege.
Keep well.